second panel discussion for this People's History of Hurricane Katrina conference. And what we have here today is a good number of folks who have written and researched Katrina from the perspective of the 99%. So these aren't people you'll see on TV, but they are people who teach at universities and definitely have showed support for the workers and African Americans of New Orleans. They came down here on their own dime. They don't get paid a penny to present, and they have something worthwhile to say. We didn't have to fly these people in like at some of these Hurricane Katrina official events where you know, they get put in the Hotel Monteleone and they probably get a $10,000 for speaking or whatever. These are people who came out of their heart and out of their pocketbook to participate in this conference, where we celebrate the freedom of Juan and Jasper, but we continue to fight for the freedom of everyone else. So let me introduce our speakers. One is an old friend of ours, and a friend of the public housing movement, who grew up in New Orleans, but now teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And some of you may have, he's often published in national articles. This is Adolph And Adolph, like all the other speakers, will be participating in this discussion, the theme of which is from disaster capitalism to a real reconstruction program, jobs for all, and free public services for all. This is, I guess, basically say a people's Katrina recovery. Second, we have Cedric Johnson. And hi, Cedric. And Cedric is a professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So if any of you have ever been to Chicago, you haven't been too far from Cedric. And he is from Opelousas, Louisiana. So all you Cajuns out there, we got a Cajun over here. I went to USL. But anyway, so he will be participating, giving his learning perspective on what needs to be done, and what's happened, what things we could do to make it better. Then there is Jay Arena, who in addition to being a Katrina survivor and a jack of all political trades, is also a professor at the City University of New York, Staten Island, CNY. And in addition, we have Adrienne Dixson, who teaches at the University of Illinois. And she did teach in New Orleans for a while. Also, we have Megan Marcelin, who will raise your hand, Megan, wherever he is. Okay, she's back there, excuse me. She'll be quite happy to participate from her chair for any questions you might have. She's written a lot about Katrina and has a wonderful article, I believe, in the Jacobite magazine, which is an online magazine. It's free, so everybody here can afford it if they get to the computer. And then, almost on that computer. And then finally we have another friend of ours who came out of town for free, willing to speak for free, whose heart is in with the struggle, and that's Jill Stein, the presidential candidate for the Green Party. So let's give him a little welcome, okay?
Both Mike and Jay and everyone else who organized this event, thank you for inviting me to participate in it. And I also want to say thank you to the Jaspers and other folks who've been here struggling on the ground. I hope you all know that those of us who are not here are with you all in spirit and have been, cheering you on and talking about you in other places and trying to get more support for the fight for public housing, for affordable housing in the city. I also want to thank you all, the audience, right? Because I think that as residents here, you need to be lauded and praised for having put up with so much bullshit about resiliency for the past, not even just the past week, but it seems like for a couple of months now. I think we should start just simply by saying that this notion of resiliency, I'll start by saying, we should see it as purely as an ideological category, right? I mean, it's a way to try to inspire a certain kind of civic boosterism and to ally people around what's essentially a pro-market recovery project. It's also a way to squeeze out contradictions and really penalize those persons who are not faring that well, right? People who have not recovered, folks who are still struggling to make a living or to find a place to live and to find adequate education, quality education for their children. So I think that's something that we need to reject right away. I don't know where to start as far as the criticisms of the official language around recovery, right? There's a few things I just want to point out quickly before going into the heart of my presentation. But I'm sure those of you who saw Mitch Landrieu on Face the Nation this morning. He gave a speech out in front of Jackson Square. And it was interesting that he would start out, as so many people do, acknowledging the government failures of the Katrina disaster, right? The federal flood, as folks like to call it here. But then he turned around and began talking about black male violence, right, in the city, which is a scourge. It's something that we all want to address. But the way in which he acknowledged the foundations of it, he turned away from any focus on policy failure, and he emphasized parenting and modifying people's behavior as the main focus. He didn't even touch on, of course, the massive upward redistribution of wealth that he's facilitated as mayor. There's also just a weird thing I want to say, just because I feel like I need to mention it, but Donna Brazil's comments in light of George W. Bush's visit, I guess it was on Friday or Saturday, where she said that the city needs to welcome him, right, with open arms. And what is that about, right? I mean, here we are. It seems that everybody acknowledges that his actions as president not only made the Army Corps' work more difficult, right? I mean, he cut support for the Southeast Louisiana flood control system year before Katrina, but even in office, right? He just seemed totally inept and unconcerned about the evacuation that should have happened a lot sooner. Part of what I want to focus on today is the people's history, the way I imagine this conference working against all the other things that have been said over the past week or months. When I think about the people's history, I'm not thinking about just a celebration of resistance per se. But what I would hope is that we can get into a real analysis of class relations and class power, and an understanding of politics that gets into interest and questions of power. What do I mean by power? I'm not talking about me wearing, my hair a certain way, or certain clothes, or wearing bumper stickers. But I'm talking about the capacity to realize one's will or interest, even in the face of opposition to others. And I think that's what our work should be about, right? Building real power and engaging in the kinds of strategic questions about building working class power in particular, which is needed now more than ever. There's one quick story I want to relate before getting into the heart of this all. A story that one of my co-workers used to tell. For a long time I taught at a school called Hobart and William Smith College, a really elite, small liberal arts college in Western New York. And I co-taught a class on labor with a guy named Christopher Gunn, who had been there as long as I've been alive, right? And at the beginning of every class on labor, he would talk about a visit by the historian Christopher Lash, who delivered a commencement address, right, in front of all of these well-heeled, affluent folks. And at one point during his speech, this is in the late 70s, Lash mentioned the word capitalism. And Chris recalls like an audible gasp going up from this audience of Northeastern Brahmins, right, who just couldn't believe that he would even name it, right, that he would name the system or the process that we all live under. Not only do we need to name it, but we need to be clear about the contradictions that are unfolding out in front of us. What I want to focus on is the questions of labor post-Katrina. I know that Adrienne's going to talk about education, and Jay is definitely going to talk about public housing. But I want to add another dimension by discussing labor, and I want to use this notion, a whole notion from Marx, which I think we don't use enough, of the Industrial Reserve Army, because I think it helps us to understand a lot of what has happened over the past decade. To put it bluntly, right, the notion of the Reserve Army is this, right? And Adolph, correct me if I totally botched this, right? It's essentially an argument about the political and economic uses of unemployment. It's essentially an argument which says that having more labor than it needs is an advantageous situation for capitalists. Having labor more than it needs, and also having desperate people, unemployed, out of work people, is advantageous for capital, right? It's conducive for profit making. What we saw after Katrina was a coordinated effort at all levels of government to induce insecurity in this population in the city, and to create a race to the bottom as far as wages were concerned. So there's a few different layers I want to highlight, and there's a lot of different guilty parties here we can talk about. For one, we saw Lincoln engage in a wave of layoffs. 3,000 public employees, supposedly non-essentials, how they label public employees. Another round, 7,500 public school teachers, most of them African-American women. I mean, just how counterintuitive is that, right? If you're trying to repopulate the city and have people available, right, to repopulate neighborhoods, to provide labor that could have been used for reconstruction in the short term, right? Why would you lay them off? It's also counterintuitive from Nathan's vantage point as the sitting mayor. Why would he get rid of the very populations that put him in office, in part, right? Maybe there are other folks who pull the strings. But why would he get rid of that part of his electoral constituency for the sake of trying to prove to those in Congress that he would be fiscally responsible? At the national level, we saw more of the same, right? The Bush administration, in those immediate weeks after the disaster, waived the Davis-Bacon Act provisions that required that all federal contractors provide proof of citizenship, as well as that they pay a prevailing wage, right? On top of that, you also had the momentary waiver of Department of Labor policy, which would have encouraged all federal contractors to provide affirmative action plans, right? And then you had OSHA regulations, right? Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards momentarily suspended. All of those things were restored, but in the short run, what they did was they created that race to the bottom, where you had, various contractors driving to Houston and other places to round up some of the most vulnerable and desperate workers that they could, and the result was predictable, right? At its height, from what I've seen, we had as high as many as 30,000 workers here engaged in the construction, mostly from Mexico and Central America originally, but some of them were also from places as far away as Brazil and India. The abuses of these folks are well documented. People like Nicole Trujillo-Pagan has written extensively about this. Situations of underpayment and non-payment, violence and coercion, inadequate and in many instances non-existent safety equipment for people who work in hazardous conditions. An average workday of between 10 and 12 hours. And in some reports, people working as long as 15-hour days. This is bad for all workers, right? And it's certainly bad for people who are trying to come back to the area to get back on their feet. Now, added to that, and I haven't seen enough of this, where people not only talk about migrant construction labor, but they combine it with an analysis of volunteers, right? And I'm somewhat responsible, like a lot of people. Like that was one of my ways of returning here to help out in the short run, would be to bring groups of people to work in the recovery. But there's an important problem there, right, that we need to think about. In those first 5 years after Katrina, there were 1 million people, the last count that I saw. 1 million people that participated in the recovery or reconstruction as volunteers. Mostly students, but also people from different churches. Christopher Manning, who's a historian at Loyola University in Chicago, is actually is doing an oral history project about volunteers. And he and I disagree. He sees it as some sort of new civil rights movement and compares these folks to, freedom riders, right? People who came down to help with voter registration and to push the desegregation laws back, advanced desegregation in the South. I don't agree with that, right? I think that there's certain problems with volunteerism. For one, is it depoliticizes political issues, right? It allows people to engage in benevolent activity without necessarily taking the risks that are involved in real political activity, right? And so there's that problem, but there's others that I want to touch on quickly before I run out of time. For one, you got to think about what impact this sort of signal of unpaid labor has had on wage floors for those who are wage, right? Those people who are working for a living. I mean, it certainly put them in a situation where they couldn't contest. I mean, in addition to having, undocumented status in some cases and being vulnerable in that way, now they're dealing with this other wave of free and unwaged labor, which certainly had an impact of devaluing migrant wage labor in qualitative and relative terms. Why would homeowners, that's the question I want to ask, why would homeowners want to employ wage laborers if they could get exuberant students and devout church members to complete the same work for free? Donated labor, I would argue, was low cost monetarily, but it was also free of the exploitative relationships that might have made some people feel uncomfortable. So it made volunteer labor much more desirable in so many ways. There's also the problem with respect to this property owner-centered recovery project, because most folks who volunteered were volunteering to support single-family home renovation or owner-occupied dwellings, not apartment buildings typically, even though there's some exceptions. And so again, they help to reinforce this bias towards homeowners to the disadvantage of renters. The last thing I'll say, because I'm not sure I'm looking on time, and this is a bit of a criticism. I don't want you to hear me. This is not a criticism of people who volunteer, right? I'm not one of those folks who refers to them as carpetbaggers, like I know some of you all have. And let me say why we should stop using that phrase for a few different reasons, right? For one, we have to first acknowledge its origins, that it's a reactionary terminology that was used by defeated Confederates who resented the fact that the federal government was now engaging in a progressive project of incorporating blacks into the Republic after the Civil War. And so those whites who came down to help, Northerners who came down to help in the late 1860s and 70s were referred to as carpetbaggers, as a put down, right, by Southerners who wanted to go back to the old era, which they originally ultimately they got their wish, right? I think that we got to stop using it, right? Because if we really straightforward, we really wanted people who were carpetbaggers here, right? We wanted people who were willing to engage in a really strong, federally supported project that would have been one that was hoping to ensure equality, right? And widespread protection of all citizens, not just those who own homes or who had adequate insurance or could access road home funds. But we would want some sort of national policy that was about reconstructing the entire city and not just a certain group of people. So I think it's unfair to the historical carpetbaggers, but it also mischaracterizes what's going on here. If anything, the reverse is true. What you saw were volunteers who came down and actually supported the reproduction of inequality in this city. So I think we can do better. I have a whole bunch of things that I can say about this, but I'll go ahead and pause there so that other folks can have time to speak. But thank you.
I have been engaged in kind of a long-term project, looking at the reforms, the education reforms in New Orleans post-Katrina. So I've been coming here probably since 2007. Initially, I wanted to go into schools and kind of get a sense of my previous research had been kind of the micro classroom level. What does teaching and good teaching look like in classrooms, in particular in urban classrooms? And looking at teachers of color who are quote-unquote good teachers. So what does that look like? So I was interested, because I had been a teacher here, that what would good teaching look like in the context of Katrina? From the research field, good teachers kind of draw context and use the social-political moment to engage in blah, 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 blah. So I was interested in would that happen? How would people deal with kind of what's happening post-Katrina? And in the midst of this, the teachers are experiencing the same kind of trauma that kids were experiencing. So what would school look like? What would teaching look like? And so I came down, I had some generous support from my university and a center called the Kerwin Center for Race and Ethnicity. A colleague of John Powell, who's now at UC Berkeley, gave me really funded me really well. And I came and the context of schools had changed. Who was running schools was radically different. I knew that because actually I had hosted people in my own, I tell people going, immediately after the storm, so I knew that the landscape of school had changed, but I wasn't fully aware of how it really had changed. And so came with my little, my little description of the project and little handouts for people to sign, and walked from school to school, only to be turned away in part because the players were very different. So none were local. The school leadership teams were not locals, and they would often refer me to their home office that was in Chicago or New York or Connecticut or somewhere else. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll just go to Lusher, because I know Lusher, at least they're somewhat stable, and had to go through several layers. I didn't know that Kathy Wright was whatever role she had. I was not aware of that. And so I met with the principal, but the principal actually didn't make the decision. It was Kathy Ryder and her people. And so they were not interested in having anyone research on their school. But it was quite interesting because I knew the school. I was surprised that Lusher's at Fortune. What is Lusher doing at Fortune? And to go in, and the building it's beautiful. I mean, it was completely made over with marble floors, and there was an elevator, and there are these marble stands for kids' art. It's like, wow, this is really amazing. And what was even more amazing was the cast iron gate that had been erected I don't know if it's cosmetic, but I don't know what the official line is, but clearly it's to mark not to make it accessible, so it's no longer accessible. So I could not get access to schools, and in the midst of all this, is in 2008, the fall of 2008, the master planning was going on, master planning for the city and master planning for the school. So I would sit in, so my project changed from what happens in classrooms, because I didn't have access to classrooms, kind of how are people making sense of what's happening, and how would schooling configure into this kind of master planning? And so there were several meetings happening at the same time, and often there would be the same people. So people would be in master planning meetings for their community areas of the zone, and then there was the master planning for schools and what schools would look like. And I've had the advantage of being in meetings where the previous superintendent, Paul Alice, referred to Teach for America core members as an endless supply of labor. So there was Teach for America, and then another group called Teach NOLA. And Teach NOLA's job was to pick up where the Teach for America core members left off. So there was kind of informal data where Teach for America core members would come in August, and they would leave by Christmas. Teach NOLA folks would be recruited in the fall semester and would start after Christmas break to fill in this gap of the labor that the labor supply. And so Teach NOLA is a cousin to Teach for America because it's Michelle Reeves comes out of the New Teacher Project. So it's a related organization. So it would make sense that it would be a similar kind of pattern. The difference with Teach NOLA is that they would recruit teachers from other places. So the criticism has been because they didn't, and it was by design, they would not recruit teachers from New Orleans. So you could, if you were from Chicago, or you were from Connecticut, or Oregon, or whatever, you could come to New Orleans and teach. If you were a teacher from New Orleans and didn't have a job, however, you couldn't go to Teach NOLA. And so my research suggests that people who push back are not crazy. Like there was a concerted effort to radically change the landscape of education in New Orleans. And so before Katrina, African American teachers made up about 72% of the teaching force, with African American women about 60% of that. After Katrina now, black teachers are 50%. About a little under 50% of the teacher labor force. So New Orleans was unique. Unlike other urban districts, New Orleans actually didn't have a demographic mismatch with teachers. In other districts, in other urban districts, there is a demographic mismatch. In Chicago and other places where I've been in colleges to work, and the issues that the union was fighting against several years ago with Rahm Emanuel was that they were closing schools, and the teachers who were being impacted by the school closures were African American teachers. And they were pushing Rahm to, one, not close schools, but also ensure that teachers, that when you close schools, that African American teachers would retain their jobs and not get fired. But there was a demographic mismatch in Chicago, so there were black teachers, but not the same level as Chicago, as New Orleans. And so now in New Orleans we have kind of an interesting trend that doesn't quite make sense. We don't want to match we don't want to match the demographics of other districts in the U.S. We actually want to retain, and we know. So where districts say they can't find that diversity, and that's what we're hearing now. The Education Research Alliance, the group from Tulane, said, "Oh, well, there's a lot of interest in trying to diversify the teacher force." Well, you didn't have to do that. They created this demographic mismatch, and they didn't have to do that. One of a couple of pieces that I kind of want to speak back to. So one, the demographic mismatch, yes, it's real. The data bears that out. We see a kind of a downward trend from Katrina on in terms of the loss of African American teachers. Now, one, is hard to track that because the only data that I've had access to is what the LDO puts out, but they only put out they only have released data from Orleans Parish. So for charter schools, it's even more difficult to kind of track because John White just hasn't released that data. Like I don't have access to it. And the Department of Ed has actually been sued because they have not been forthcoming with sharing data. So that's one kind of piece that I think we need to be clear about is the loss of black teachers is significant, and it's significant for New Orleans because that was an issue. The other piece that I think is important to put out related to the teachers is that I've presented other places and talked about the teacher firing, and people said, well, they shouldn't have fired because they were inept. Actually, the teachers weren't fired because they were inept. They were fired because Orleans Parish and the state said they didn't have the funds to pay them. That if they were financially insolvent, and so they couldn't afford to keep that. They couldn't afford it. They just didn't have money. They couldn't do it. So they had to release the teachers. And in fact, when the teachers filed a lawsuit, they filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. They won at 2 levels, and then the Supreme Court rejected their case, and the federal Supreme Court refused to hear it. But what came out in court was that Cecil Picard actually had written to Margaret Spelling, who was the Secretary of Education Education at the time and asked for funds to pay teachers. They asked for funds because they wanted and it was, he died during all this, but his spirit lives on through his emails and letters, that he requested funds from the federal government so that they could retain teachers. And then they didn't use those funds to retain teachers. They actually used those funds to enter into agreements with Teach NOLA, Teach for America, and then to recruit a kind of transient and novice teaching force. So that actually came out in a report. So that's an important piece to speak back to. And the teachers, the veteran teachers, had to kind of live with this stigma that they were inept, that they weren't good enough, that they were the cause of, and therefore their firing is justified, and that's just not true. The other thing in regard to kind of the quote-unquote success of schools, they're using kind of test score data. They're, again, because the Department of Ed doesn't release data to every researcher. The state Supreme Court has allowed them to select the researchers that they will release data to. So kind of regular, I guess I'm a regular folk, I don't have access. But so it's hard to actually to verify some of this data. But from what we can see, the test scores are really inconsequential because the state, before Katrina was one of the Orleans Parish and one of the lowest performing districts in the state, they're still among the lowest performing districts. There hasn't been a lot of movement in terms of test scores. So if we just use test scores, that success is like, what, who cares? But the bigger issue is the loss of kind of democratic participation. I did an interview with 538 and had a long discussion with this young woman about, it's like, is there anything good that you can say about what's happened? No, there's nothing good I can say about what's happened. And so one of the only quote she put in there is that she went on and talked about the test scores, but as Dr. Dixson pointed out, the community engagement is not what it should be, and perhaps we should be concerned about that. That should be the primary concern that we have. When we lose the opportunity to participate in the selection of who will govern our schools, who will work in our schools, I think that should be one of our primary concerns, and that has been, people have been wholly disenfranchised in that way. And so I don't think I need to tell you all about the charter schools, which they select their own boards. They're not elected, and so that represents a whole set of issues because the schools often reflect the perspectives and the hopes of the charter boards that govern them. So I wouldn't count that as a success, and I think that's probably one of the major losses since the reforms.
Weigh in and chime in as well to thank Jay and Mike for creating this forum, again, to debunk the prevailing mythology and the propaganda out there that this is a great success. In the words of Mitch Landrieu, nobody can refute that we have completely turned this story around. So it's really quite wonderful that we are debunking that very toxic mythology and all doing our part to make it clear that this has not been a complete turnaround, and arguably not a turnaround, well, a turnaround for the few. This is not a recovery, this is really an emergency, and it's an ongoing emergency. And just a word about my background, I'm in awe of the academics and the wise people here on the panel and in the room. I am not one of those illustrious academics. I'm actually a rogue medical doctor, a refugee from a very unjust system. In short, I didn't feel good giving people pills and procedures and pushing them back out to the things that were making them sick to start with. So now when people ask me what kind of medicine I'm practicing, I say I'm practicing political medicine because it's the mother of all illnesses. We got to that one. That's literally killing us. So it's really a great honor to be down here, and I'm just going to sort of share some reflections as someone who hasn't been here before, looking in, and again in incredible awe of, I wouldn't say the resilience, the resistance and the transformation that's going on here. And I'm so grateful to the people of New Orleans for what you have endured, your courage to keep fighting, and to not be silenced and not be sort of pigeonholed into sort of a false market-based glossed over narrative. You're not doing that, and it's wonderful driving around the city, participating in the anniversary events. It's just so clear the continuing churn and struggle that's going on here. And I say this as someone who's really, inspired and uplifted by this struggle and the beauty and art and color and music of the struggle. But I also say it as someone who benefits from the struggle in New Orleans, because New Orleans is the leading edge of disaster by design. And as New Orleans goes, so goes the nation and certainly the world as well on all those struggles. The big ones that jump out obviously are the social and economic struggle, the struggle against systemic racism, which is very dovetailed with that social and economic struggle, and the ecological struggle and the climate struggle. And it's so critical that we solve all of those problems, and I so much appreciate the framing of this forum. Again, the title being Disaster Capitalism, Jobs for All and Public Services for All, because these aren't just separate, dots here. They're all symptoms of a very sick and predatory economic and political system in which the vast majority of us are victims in so many dimensions. And so we can struggle on each of those issues, but we also have to struggle together. It's very critical that we struggle together so that we have critical mass to actually make this change, and so that we're actually getting down to the roots of the problem here, because if we're just working around the edges, we may have more readily achievable goals, but we have to do more than those goals, or the system will continue to throw us all under the bus. So it's so important that we continue exactly this kind of discussion that's happening here today. And it's clear coming in from the outside, and when you're a national candidate, you have the honor of visiting many hotspots, many front lines of struggle around the country. And I'm so struck by the enormity of the struggle here, and how, just the endless courage and energy that the people of New Orleans have to keep struggle on so many fronts at once. So I greatly appreciate the hard work that you're doing and its importance for all of us. And just very quickly, acknowledging that this struggle is about greater than 50% African American unemployment among African American men, in spite of this glut of construction that's taking place here in the city. Those jobs have just not been available to residents and to African American men in particular. The high rates of child poverty, the enormity of the black-white income gap and how that has expanded massively, which I might note, all these trends have their parallels nationally as well, and I'll come to that in a second. The privatization of the schools, the destruction of public housing, rental units, affordable housing, the skyrocketing of rents, and systematic police violence, and really the occupation of the city by a hostile military force, and the climate crisis that is on the doorstep of the city. And all of those have their, national components, which is why this really is, what's happening here is so critical for everyone across the nation. According to the Census Bureau now, 1 in every 2 Americans are in poverty or low income and heading for poverty. African American wealth used to represent 10 cents on the dollar of Caucasian wealth, that is family wealth. It used to be an outrageous ratio of 10 to 1, and in the last 10 years it has declined from 10 to 1 to 20 to 1 because the communities of color and the African American community in particular have been so hard hit by the Wall Street waste, fraud, and abuse and the mortgage foreclosure crisis. On income, that spoke to income inequality, but just in terms of the income of everyday people, not looking specifically at the racial gap, but just the crisis, the economic crisis for everyday people. I came across an incredible statistic the other day. Household income has declined over the past 10 years by about 35%, and about 35% of all adults now who have credit cards are actually in collection. The charter school crisis, of course, is happening everywhere, and it's targeted especially at low-income and African-American communities, with about 5,000 schools in poor, largely black communities having been closed. And we know that when that happens, that doesn't help the students who get punished, basically. And certainly not the teachers as well, who lose their jobs, but the students who are getting dislocated, are increasingly stressed. This system was justified by assisting supposedly challenged learners. This system was supposed to help challenged learners, but there's no one that it has hurt more than low income and communities of color. And kids who are challenged in learning are all the more challenged for having to go through the kind of dislocation that takes place in a school system pushed initially by George Bush, but then pushed by Barack Obama and the leadership of the Democratic Party as well. In fact, in the recent vote that took place in Congress to reauthorize No Child Left Behind in its current incarnation, which has a slightly different name, the Democratic Party leadership voted against an amendment that would have allowed parents to opt out of high-stakes testing. High-stakes testing that pushes kids down, further down the school-to-prison pipeline, because it promotes school failure among vulnerable kids. So, this has been a bipartisan disaster, and I'll say that not only for charter schools, but indeed the whole economic crisis and the Wall Street crash. We have to look no further than Bill Clinton for laying the groundwork for that. Likewise, for the 3 strikes you're out and the explosion of the prison population. This is clearly a bipartisan disaster, and I think it's so important when we talk about building coalitions. In my view, a political party is basically, or should be, it's not in this day and age when parties have been hijacked by big money, but a political party is supposed to be a coalition across issues, across generations, across geography, that holds together over time, a coalition. And a people-powered coalition, is what we need, coalitions that are not hijacked by Wall Street, because Wall Street, corporate money, the oligarchy, the ruling class, whatever you want to call it, they've been firmly in control. They have hijacked politics as we know it. In my view, independent politics is really a critical part of how we come together and how we fight back, and not being intimidated into worrying about the lesser evil, because if you look carefully at what has been wrought by both of the political parties, it's hard to say who's the greater and who's the lesser. We have a motto in our campaign that says, forget the lesser evil, fight like hell for the greater good. Because if we don't fight for it, nobody else is going to. It really does fall to us. So I'm going to just jump to what do I have, like 2 minutes? Okay, so just in conclusion, I want to underscore the title again, Jobs for All and Public Services for All, because this is not only something that we deserve a right to a job, and you won't hear this out there in the corporate media, but most of the American public, as recently as a poll taken to a job, the public supports a right to a job and supports living wages to keep working people out of poverty. So we have won in the court of public opinion, actually, on most of these issues. The public also supports cutting the military and supporting true security here at home. We must also abolish student debt and just cancel it. We did it for the Wall Street predators to the tune of $17 trillion. How about we start bailing out the young people for all forms of post-secondary debt? Because they didn't cause this, they are victims of that waste, fraud, and abuse on Wall Street. We could afford $17 trillion for Wall Street, we can afford $1.3 trillion for our younger generation. And along with jobs for all, we need education for all, and that includes high quality, first class, public education for everyone from preschool through college and university. We should not be in the business of exploiting our younger generation and creating a generation of indentured servants. We need to launch our young people with security into their coming lives and into the creation of a new economy. That doesn't happen by itself, and it doesn't happen when people are basically enslaved by debt. And I'll just say quickly, in creating jobs, we can both create jobs that provide public services, which we urgently need, teaching, healthcare, after school, elder care, etc., all kinds of public services. We can also create those jobs by creating an emergency transition to a green economy. 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. We can do that. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, at the start of the Second World War, you know how long it took to transition to a war economy? It took 6 months to get 25% of GDP into a wartime footing. Certainly in the next 10 years, we can convert to a green economy. And in doing that, we can create 100% clean renewable energy, we can create sustainable local agriculture, which is not only better for the planet, it's way better for us, the people, as well. It's a way healthier food supply. And Cuba showed what a difference it made when their oil pipeline went down. In 1990, they lost their oil supply when the Soviet Union broke up. They had to convert to a green economy overnight. Clean energy, 100% organic food system, and public transportation using a lot of active transportation as well, walking and biking. We have a right to safe streets and sidewalks. And when you do that, what happened to them? They got healthy. Even though their economy was crashing, by moving to a green economy, their death rate from diabetes went down 50%, their death rate from heart attacks went down 35%, their death rate from strokes went down about 25%. So they had a health revolution just by moving to a green economy. It didn't cost them a penny. We spend $3 trillion a year, not on health care, largely on sick care. We make people sick, and then we do expensive things with all kinds of side effects to try to help you keep your head above water, but it also makes you go bankrupt. So we've got a crazy system, we can fix it, and in doing that, we can solve the climate crisis, we can end wars for oil and make them obsolete because we won't need them anymore, we can put everyone back to work, and we can retrieve our health. So there is a win-win here that they don't want you to know about. It's actually right there waiting to be put to work. And I look forward to working with others here to help build that demand that we have a job, a good living wage job for everyone, that we have it now, and we do it in real time, that not only solves our economic crisis, but also solves the climate crisis. Because right now they're predicting the Antarctic and Greenland are melting 10 times faster than what science previously thought. This is most recent science published in the last 3 weeks. It's melting way faster than they thought. They're now predicting 10 feet or more of sea level rise potentially in the next 50 years. So we got to start fixing this now. We got to come together, stand up, and stand strong to demand the just, sustainable, and peaceful green future that we deserve and that is within our reach. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Jay and Mike and others who were responsible for organizing this. I absolutely want to thank the Glovers and the Jaspers and other people who've been here fighting like around the clock since August of 2005 and actually before. It's funny, like I've been here for 10 days, I think now, mainly sort of doing stuff with my mother and trying to avoid, you know, the stuff out there, the triumphalism. But I think I've been won over because I saw a story that kind of filtered through a few days ago that Archbishop Amen, who some of you may know as an asshole when he was in the seminary, and some of you may know or you recall that when Katrina hit, 3 fingers of the statue of the Sacred Heart that's behind the cathedral in French Quarter were broken off. And Archbishop then pledged, I forget which one it was, Schulte maybe, or Hannon, I forget, pledged that Hughes pledged that they wouldn't be replaced until the city has recovered. And I just happened to see a press conference where Eamon just stuck the fingers back on the statue and announced we recovered. So I guess I should throw my talk away now because it has no point. But yeah, I mean we've all been living through this moment of triumphalism, right? But the triumphalism about having overcome or having recovered from Katrina, according to the ways that people in charge like to think of recovery, is really an element, and other speakers have hit on this point too, but it's really an element of a different kind of triumphalism, right? And it's a triumph of neoliberalism, right, as an ideology and a vision. Now that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, right? I mean, it's all over the academy, it's all over the internet, it's all over everywhere. And I tend to think of neoliberalism in a couple ways. One, as the geographer David Harvey put it succinctly, is that neoliberalism is 2 things, right? It's a combination of a free market utopian ideology and a practical program for aggressive and intensified upward transfer of resources. And then Harvey goes on to point out that when there's a conflict between those 2 principles, guess which one wins? Some friends of mine and I have also started to think of it in kind of another way from a worker's perspective, which is that what neoliberalism is really is just capitalism that sort of freed itself from effective working class opposition. Because this is what capitalism was before the 1930s. And this is what capitalism has been in much of the rest of the world. I mean, I go back to Cedric's point about the Industrial Reserve Army. I mean, that's the essence of capitalist political economy. It's that exploitation. And that's a notion that's been lost. It's a notion that's been lost among people who consider themselves to be on the left. I mean, there have been recent debates, again, running through the internet, which is now where the left lives mainly, I think, in the last few months about whether capitalism means anything anymore, or socialism means anything anymore, or the working class means anything anymore. But what I suggest is, to bring those debates down to some concrete considerations that I think help to underscore just how complete the cultural victory of neoliberalism has been after 40 years. I mean, this is really an attack that, well, I mean, I'm trying to argue now it actually started, or the zygote was formed in the Kennedy administration. But certainly by the second half of the Carter administration with the Volcker shock. And the emergence of phrases like the following, and I'm going to offer these phrases and quips as illustrations of the extent to which Margaret Thatcher's dictum that the method is economics, but the purpose is changing the human soul, was not only the objective, but it's an objective that's been realized more than a lot of us like to think. For instance, productivity. I'm I've reached the point in life where I can either put my glasses on and see my text, or take them off and see the audience. So I'm going to go back and forth. But productivity, right? All Americans are almost inclined to cross ourselves when we hear productivity. But where does productivity come from in a capitalist economy? Yeah, a lot of it is machines and shit and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's fundamentally the displacement or the increased rate of exploitation of human labor, either through displacement by technological processes that do what? Increase the size of the Industrial Reserve Army and exert downward wage pressures, or in more old-fashioned ways, increasing the rate of exploitation. For instance, cutting, but what that means concretely, right, in contemporary America is cutting all of the social protections that working people have won in this country since the 1930s. And that's what privatization is all about. Like gutting the public sector is ultimately, with or without consciousness, with or without conscious intent, it's ultimately about increasing the rate of exploitation by reducing people's capacities to do anything other than accept work on whatever terms employers want to offer. I live in Philadelphia. I've got a very good friend who's a union leader in Atlantic City. One of the casinos down there, Taj Mahal, that's operated currently by a jerk-off named Carl Icahn. 9 or 10 months ago, he's steering Trump's property through bankruptcy, and he sweet-talked the bankruptcy judge into letting him peremptorily cancel health care and pension benefits for 2,500 workers in his casino. Boom, overnight. Right? And he calls himself the champion of the little guy, because that's the world that we live in now. Because little guy is comparatively small investor, right? And the rest of us don't count the digit. All right, so that's productivity. Oh yeah, this is one of my favorites. Doing more with less, right? I'm the architect, and in one of my earlier lives, I was a budget analyst for a city government. Around the time that this doing more with less thing got sexy in the late 70s, because that's what smart people do, right? In fact, that's what TFA does, right? TFA helps you do more with less, because these kids from Princeton are really smart. But as the architect Buckminster Fuller said at some point, I think also in the late 70s, you don't do more with less. You do more and more, you do less with less. That's why they call more, and they call less. So it's the same, but this is the same kind of thing that sort of flies by our heads when you hear it on the news, and people don't balk, right? Because it doesn't sound as stupid as it should sound. And the reason it doesn't sound as stupid as it should sound isn't that people are stupid or that they've got their heads up their asses and watching Kim Kardashian. It's that the corporate newsrotainment industry and education and higher ed is especially guilty of this, has just sold all this stuff as common sense. And common sense is the stuff that you know because you know, right? You know it's true because you know it's true prior to investigation, or without any investigation or reflection. And there's a steady drumbeat of this. And I'm going to I'm going to say something specific about the fights that we've been through here since Katrina in that regard. Privatization, that's another one, right? And that's, I already let that cat out of the bag, right? I mean, it's always been a way, when governments first started touting privatization as a way to realize the efficiencies of the market, Again, this was at a time when I was working in the budget department, and I was stunned to find out that it's common, most common, for privatized public service contracts to come with guarantees of profit rates and with the subsidies. And he said, wait a minute, I thought the whole purpose of this was to have the rationality in the market. But it's like we learned with Goldman Sachs and the big Wall Street firms that the discipline of the market just applies to the money-making part, right? Like it doesn't apply to the losing part, right? And thus, for instance, Michael Harrington, who was author of The Other America, and founder of what eventually was the Democratic Socialists of America, said, like in 1968, what we have in America is socialism for the rich and free enterprise for the poor. And that's kind of where we are. Okay, so privatization, I don't need to go on about that. Now, I mean, this leads to a couple of illustrations based on the New Orleans case that I wanted to make. I was in and out of the city around the public housing sites and did whatever I could to assist. Ultimately, we lost. But one of the reasons that we lost was that we were never able to connect deeply enough with the constituency most likely, or that would objectively be most likely to support the struggle. And that is the great working class black constituency in the city. Among other things, these are the people who are most likely to have had direct or indirect personal experience with public housing. But what happened, I remember this from my own anecdotal experience from talking to people. I know you guys are much, much better. Two things happened. One is a genuine empathy. And people would say, yeah, I think it's kind of messed up that these projects are being closed because there's a need for affordable housing. But everybody knows, and this is back to the common sense thing, that public housing breeds pathologies, right? And it's kind of like it's about Vietnam vets who years after the war were absolutely convinced that they'd had the experience of being spat on by anti-war protesters when the service records show that absolutely could not have happened. But it's the way that ideology, constant drumbeat of a hegemonic ideology, can change one's own memories of one's own experience. And about the public housing thing in particular, one that got me was like, in addition to all of the other pathologies that it was supposed to breed, it was also argued to breed poverty. Well, when you had to be practically church mouse poor to qualify to get into public housing in the first place. So, how does that breed poverty, right? But, so, that leads to another ideological category that I think has been very important and we need still to work overtime to figure out how to overcome. And that's the notion of an urban underclass and an ecological understanding of where poverty comes from. By which I mean that poverty grows out of conditions of the neighborhood that you're in and people you associate with. It's all versions, really. Like when I was a kid, one of the wines that we drank here was Gallo's Sweet Vino. It was like 46 cents a fifth, and the shit it did to your liver, I don't even want to think of it. And then, when I was an adult, this place got taken by something called Night Train or MD 2020. The thing is, it's all the same rot gut stuff, but what changes is the label. What was called a half century ago the culture of poverty is the underclass now. It's the same fairy tales, right? But what they do, or what that fairy tale does, is in fact racializes poverty, right? It racializes poverty. And one of the things that happened here was that the discourse of the disreputable underclass was part of establishing a post-Katrina norm of civic respectability that along with another one that I'm going to mention here, what I've called, following Robert Self, the historian, homeowner populism. right? When, I mean, you remember when the Urban Land Institute, which by the way was an industry think tank that was created in the 1940s to combat public housing, by the way. But when the Urban Land Institute did a report for the Bring New Orleans Back Commission that proposed bringing back neighborhoods on a triage model defined by real estate prices or values prior to Katrina, everybody knew what that meant, right? So black people here and who hadn't gotten back yet were raising hell. Nagin then backs up, and like this is the context in which Nagin made the Chocolate City stage, right? Because Nagin had just come to realize that where he ran as the white candidate in 2002, because he won, you may remember, with like 2/3 of the white vote and 1/3 of the black vote, that there were real white people running this time, and they had to do something different. So he had to become a black candidate, and he gave out the reassurance that all people would be able to come back, all neighborhoods were going to be rebuilt, and that kind of pulled things out a little bit, except it turns out that practically what that meant, and Cedric also made this point, was that homeowners came to stand in for the neighborhood. So it's like an 18th century notion of civic membership, right? Based on the property that you own. So here we have at the same moment, and frankly at the time, I think I may have said this today, I didn't understand why they were so fixated on destroying public housing at that moment when it was so obvious that the need for affordable housing was so great. I think part of it was Alphonso Jackson, who was Bush's HUD secretary and has been a character witness for Clarence Thomas in 1991. I don't have to say any more than that, do I? But Thomas had a crony in Atlanta that he wanted to give the demolition contract to, but there was more than that. And I think that, again, probably not with any self-consciousness or complete self-consciousness. That's not really the way the ideology works, frankly. But what happened was the combination of the homeowner populism and the underclass ideology made it possible to deal black people into the circle of civic regard as homeowners and to deal poor people out. Poor people and renters out of the equation no matter what. Okay. So where am I going with this one, I ask? Well, I'm going a couple of places. One of them is to suggest that we kind of pause and reflect on a kind of knee-jerk understanding that we all tend to operate with about race and class and what race is and isn't, and racism is and isn't, right? So that, like the historian, I don't want to get into too much, we're going into the weeds about this because I know the time limits, but what's happened since the in the post-World War II years? What was that a notion of racial justice came into existence and got built on and got consolidated as the baseline of law and ideology. That's fundamentally disconnected from the functioning of the capitalist political economy. Right? And this is a new phenomenon, right? I mean, if you look at people like Adolph the March on Washington in 1963 was organized by the Negro American Labor Council and was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And people like Randolph, Ruskin, even Whitney Young from the Urban League, all understood that because the vast majority of black people were working class people, then civil rights enforcement was never going to be enough by itself to improve the conditions of black Americans, and that it required a strong labor policy and a strong trade union movement. That's what we've lost, and one of the ways one of the sites on which we lost it, it's going to sound kind of funny, but I'm going to put responsibility for this point back on Cedric. Also, that we all have this notion now of what black militancy is. what black radicalism is. First of all, it's about giving a damn speech, right? First of all. And the kind of elephants. But it's also sort of linked to residues or vestiges of the Black Power movement in the mid to late 1960s. The more I've thought about this, the more I've examined its consequences, the more I've studied the history, the more convinced I am that Black Power wasn't a victory for us. It was a victory for the corporations and for the other side. And Cedric, in an interview a couple of years ago, made this point that, Black Americans have done politics since, I would say since 1619, but for a long time. Since before the treasonous insurrection of the elites of 11 states against the constitutional government of the United States of America from 1861 to 1865, and sometimes called the Civil War, erroneously. But something specific developed in the mid-1960s. And it's what Cedric has described as black ethnic politics. And that's kind of what we've come to understand. So, as being the death of Black American political action. What that does, among other things, is it posits as the fundamental source of a political agency among Black people, something called the Black community. And so then we evaluate people who purport to speak for the Black community or to ventriloquize the Black community on the basis of how faithfully and sincerely they represent the interests of the Black community. What that leaves us with, however, is when public officials or others do stuff that seems to mess over big sections of Black Americans, then the critical standard that we have to deal with is they've sold out or they're part of a leadership pledge. What those notions do is actually reinforce the problematic ideology in the first place, right? Fast forward a little bit. One of the reasons I would argue that we haven't been able to mount effective challenges, and people have been fighting, God knows, since August 29, 2005. One of the reasons that we haven't been able to mount effective challenges here, and this is not just a New Orleans problem either, this is a national problem, is that we don't have this metaphor, right? But in the discourse of Black political interest is so diffuse that it doesn't enable holding officials or aspirants feet to the fire on the basis of the stuff they actually do, right? And this is something I've been watching since the moment of transition. I mean, sometimes it's the best thing you can do is just happen to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, I lived in Atlanta at the moment of racial transition in local politics in the mid-70s. We got to see that up close and personal. And I lived in the state senate district where Obama emerged. I've often joked that I was in the birthing room at the origin of his new political career. That's why I've not been surprised by anything he's done. And it's not that I'm smart, I just saw it earlier. But this is where we've been, right? And this notion of who speaks for the Black community is already like an impossible notion. Because who is the Black community, right? There are Black workers, there are Black property owners, there are Black employers, there are Black landlords, there are Black renters, there are Black investment bankers, right? And to bring that back home too, especially watching how local politics has evolved here and in many other places since the moment of racial transition, once the Black, or the pattern of Black governance gets established and consolidated, then the issue, then what happens is, while people still talk about conflict and difference in racial terms, what happens is that the governing class evolves together. And this is a simple sociological phenomenon, right? They go to the same schools, they live in the same neighborhoods, their kids play on the same soccer teams, that they belong to the same damn yacht club, right? I just learned this, the Southern Yacht Club and the New Orleans Yacht Club, and it's astounding to see how normal it is, right, for black people to be there. But, but that doesn't mean they're selling out. It means that they share a class perspective, right? They consume the same stuff. They have the same pastimes, right? They have the same sense of value, the same sense of proper order of the world. That's another reason, for example, that when Mitch was elected mayor the first time, and there was a white candidate who was challenging Kareem Reed in Atlanta and a couple of others, maybe one in D.C., the black commentary around the country and here locally was just going nuts about the loss of black political power and this, that, and the other. It never occurred to me that was going to happen because they're a coherent, consistent class. And what's happened since then? We've got, what, 5 black people on the city council, and the 2012 charter amendment that separated the election of the 2 seats is like partly intended to make sure that it would be like Rex and Zulu. Sorry, I couldn't get that out. On Carnival Day, right? To join hands and govern together, because the current arrangements are working for everybody, for whom it's working, right? And for whom they're working. And I mean, those are the people who are the beneficiaries of it. And as long as the rest of us get to fight over shit like, Confederate flag or monument or who's getting this job that I thought that my brother-in-law should have had, then it all works out well. All right, so I mean, let me conclude by saying this, that where I think this, one other thing to say, and this has to do about race, and like, this is like historical point. The historian Barbara Fields has complained about how scholars today write about slavery and the relation between slavery and the white supremacy. And I think this is a pathology that originated ultimately like English departments, but then it spread a lot like a virus, right, through the rest of the university, so that everything was about production of white supremacy. And Fields said, the way they write about slavery now, you'd think that the purpose of slavery was the production of white supremacy, not cotton, rice. Because that's the key point for the way it makes sense for us to think, I think, about race and class. They aren't different. They're the same thing, or they're moments in the same dynamic. Race, like a lot of other ideologies that pretend that there are natural differences among groups of people who themselves are produced by the people claiming there are natural differences, that define where their station in life is based on who they are or what their characteristics are supposed to be, just those stories. And what those stories do, they may emerge like in natural ways or whatever, I don't know. But what those narratives do is give us stability and tend to mystify the systemic roots of the reproduction of inequality in capitalist labor relations. And that's the core of this, right? I mean, that's the core. I'll be happy to go on about that, forever, if and when the time comes. But the punchline of this then is what I thought was part of the charge of our panel, which is how to figure out how to start talking about how to get back on the offensive and to win back the stuff that we've lost and are still losing. I mean, I think that we didn't get into this situation overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight, because what I've been describing in these phrases and this notion and the dominant ideologies is something that Antonio Gramsci called hegemony. And the institutions of public opinion and the electoral process, frankly, all presume and impel toward operating within the hegemonic understanding. So how do we get out of it? Right? How do we challenge it? I don't think we can challenge it through an election, right? Which is not to say that I'm opposed to electoral politics. But I think that there's a movement organizing dynamic that we have to consider, right? And the ways that we start to build a movement, I think ought to be guided by a couple of precepts. One is that the ultimate purpose of politics is, as a wise Chinese fellow once said, to unite the many to defeat the few. So what that means is that the purpose of politics, and this is exactly what the right wing did after Goldwater was defeated in 1964. They realized, as B.B. King would say, they made their move too soon, so they backed up and dug in and did the equivalent of the 6,000-mile walk to the mountains. And they began to organize and sort of field test messages among potential constituencies. And they created constituencies. Right? God doesn't give us constituencies. Cadres create them, right? And field testing the kinds of issues that would make it possible to construct a political alliance. Not just a coalition. And I think the difference is that with the political alliance, and here's an illustration that also comes from the right. That, as you know, like the Reaganite coalition has made up for more than 35 years of two components, at least, that seem fundamentally unstable. Libertarian, rich investment bankers who don't care about social issues at all. And all they care about is money, and like holy roller freaks who don't care about anything else. But what happens in actual elections, right, is that the libertarians who couldn't care about restriction of abortion rights or gay marriage or anything like that, will vote for candidates on the social conservative side. And vice versa, because they understand that the nature of the alliance is such that such candidates win, they will work to advance the interests of both sides of the coalition. Except they'll probably play with the social conservative stuff, but they'll really come through the fiscal conservative stuff. That didn't happen automatically. It didn't happen overnight. That was a product of long-term organizing, right? Now, and that leads to this. Which is the point that I'll conclude on, that we don't have ALEC, we don't have the Koch brothers, we don't have the Olin Foundation. Hell, we don't even have the Ford Foundation, right? And they work on the other side too. What we have is the labor movement. And I know it's also fashionable for people on the left to piss on the labor movement. I've been hearing this like forever, and I keep saying, okay, well, yeah, it's only 7%, but I mean, what else you got? Right? I mean, it's better. And the trade union movement is the place where working people are organized politically as a class to the extent that they're organized politically as a class anyway. And the trade union movement is also, the only source of resources, human and financial, but especially organizing talent that our side has access to. And moreover, working people don't just live at work, right? I mean, they live in neighborhoods, right? And in bowling alleys, or bowling leagues, or alleys, and soccer leagues, and in churches. And so we need to build a movement, right? And we need to start to build a movement. And I know there's another, especially for the Trotskyists in the world, there's the sense that the urgency is such that we can't wait for a slow organizing campaign. Well, the fact of the matter is, we can't do anything without that campaign. So again, the same wise Chinese fellow said, we need to figure out how to walk on two legs, right? We need to fight for the short term and for the long term at the same time. It's not easy. No individuals are smart enough to do it on their own. That's another reason you have to have collective processes, and that's where I think we are, and that's what I think we need in the city of New Orleans and every place else in the country.
It's really happy that we were able to get this panel together. When I was talking initially with Mike, Sharon, Elizabeth, and others about doing this, we knew the garbage that we were going to face, the rulers, to celebrate their makeover of North, but we wanted to have some kind of counter to that. And the first people I reached out to and thought about were those on this panel and Megan. And I'm so glad that they were able, all of them, agreed immediately to join us. As Mike said, they came here on their own dime. And I'm really happy with Adolph. You know, when we were here in the public housing fight, we were fighting on many different terrains, but at one level, it's what Fidel Castro calls the battle for ideas. These criminals were coming at us with, we need to deconcentrate poverty. It's good for Miss Jasper and the family to be thrown out of their homes because they need, a middle-class role model somewhere. And so we were battling them on that, but we also had allies. Adolph and other colleagues of his were battling the sociologists, the academics who make money and careers off of cranking out this crap. He was going toe-to-toe with them. So even though we were down in the trenches, it was good to know we had other allies. And Mike reached out to them on that. So we, again, we're glad that they were able to join us. Now the question I want to deal with, even after Adolph's presentation on the huge ideological barriers, which I fully agree with, that we face, I want to address the question about how we win a real working class reconstruction of New Orleans, the Gulf Coast, and even our country. You know, I live in New Jersey, Newark. When I left here, I thought, well, I didn't want to leave New Orleans, but I thought at least I won't have to deal with hurricanes. 2 years later, I got Hurricane Sandy, and it got slammed, and, Christie is on top of that. Bluebird. So, now we know the ruling class, we've all talked about that. They declared victory. They're celebrating this. They've won, right? The model, as the Rockefeller Foundation and Tulane University had a conference a few years ago, New Orleans as the model, the urban model, and we're going to export it all around the world, country. I saw Paul Vallis. I almost smacked him at the Starbucks today. Hello? Oh, Vallis. Check. Okay. I said, Paul Vallis. He said, oh yeah, I'm going to shake my head out of me. But these people, he exported. Remember, he went to Chicago, New Orleans, Haiti. Right. I'm going to export it to Haiti. So they declared victory, but the fight is not over. This stage, they have won, but as Adolph emphasized, we're in a protracted struggle, right? So I want to get an answer, to get some ideas. And this is not utopianism, right? We're going to talk about real strategy. But to get some ideas, I'm going to go back to a commemoration, not of Katrina, but a 50-year commemoration, back to 65, just after I was born. And it's not Selma. I know everybody watched Selma and the movie. It's actually about an article written by one of the organizers around Selma, Bayard Rustin. Anybody ever hear about Bayard? Okay, he was a really, the article was From Protest to Politics, the Future of the Civil Rights Movement. It was published in Commentary, which was then a kind of liberal Jewish magazine, now it's kind of right-wing, cheering on, let's bomb Iran, that kind of stuff. Now, Rustin is an interesting, important figure. He played a central role in all the major civil rights protests, big civil rights protests of the mid-20th century. There's been kind of revival of interest around him. It's mostly about his sexuality. I'm not interested in what he was doing in the bedroom or wherever. I'm interested in his politics, the political strategy, as a really important organic intellectual of the civil rights movement. Now, Rustin argued in this piece that the civil rights movement had defeated, quote, the legal foundations of racism, but it had not ended the poverty, unemployment, rotten schools, housing, and other forms of oppression facing wide swaths of the Afro-American and broader working class. He said that problem was rooted not in the legal foundations of racism and Jim Crow, but, quote, in the deeply rooted but it's deeply rooted in our socio-economic order, i.e. capitalism. So he agreed, which goes against the dominant ideology that Adolph articulated about the market, the wonders of the market. Right? I don't know if everybody's seen the movie The Revolution Will Not Be Televised on Hugo Chavez. There's a great piece where he's in front of a massive crowd and he's saying, the market solves everything. Lies, lies. Right? That's what Bayard Rustin and his colleague Philip Randolph were basically saying. The market, even public-private partnerships that Press Kabikoff was cheering on the other day at the ribbon cutting at Iberville with Obama's HUD officials. They knew that that's not going to end poverty. That's for all the working class, black working class, all the working class. It's not going to end, it's not going to bring us full employment. And so Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and all others called their solution, and this is in the mid-60s, they elaborated in this freedom budget. That Adolph's son, I encourage you to read his article. He elaborates on that also in the Jacobin. Called for a mass direct government employment public works program to provide good jobs for all those able and willing to work. Full employment, millions of people. Now, of course, there's some people, elderly, children, handicapped, no, they can't work, but they should be taken care of, right? A living wage, human wage. But we need jobs for our willing to work. And we know that. Whenever they put out a job, 100 jobs, you got 10,000 people lining up. We know people want to work. And what would they be doing? Rustin and Randolph said they should be put together for direct government employment, not contracting out, to build schools, right? And we know all the crap about improving education. We know you need end poverty and you need resources into those schools, especially for poor kids. Reduced student-teacher ratio, all kinds of services that they need, many jobs afterwards. But it was to build schools, hospitals, playgrounds, clean up the environment. He was talking about, talking about the environment back in the mid-60s. And can you believe this? Right? You would never, could you imagine hearing this from civil rights leaders now, let alone the Democrats? Well-built, well-located public housing projects. Yes, he was calling for that. Well-built, well-maintained, well-financed, democratically run. Now to finance it was a little weak. They argued, well, full employment, we're going to increase GDP, it's going to increase taxes, and it'll be kind of self-supporting, right? People will be working, paying taxes, and that would be able to finance and be less costs on welfare and other programs, costs. So that's what we need. I'm taking a page. I agree with Bayard Rustin and Philip Randolph. If we're going to have a real people's reconstruction, our kind of reconstruction, where we have 100,000 people, mostly poor, working class, black, to come back, if we're going to have jobs for people, if we're going to have good housing, public education, if we're going to rebuild the levees, if we're going to have an alternative energy system, right, a crash program, we can expand beyond that. We need public works. The market will not do that. Wow, what's going on? Somebody's intervening here, maybe. Landra, the Ford Foundation is financing, I don't know what. But we also need, I would argue, it needs to be democratically controlled. Because as Cedric pointed out, capitalism needs unemployment. And so if we build a big enough movement to win it or a concession, the day after, they would be working to dismantle this program, right? And so we need it democratically organized so people can fight to defend it. And I think we also need to emphasize open for all. Rustin did as well, but especially in the context of mass incarceration, it's expanded dramatically, a prison population, you get a felony, you're denied public jobs, public benefits in many different ways. Immigrants, right? The neoliberalism abroad, the offensive has driven a whole new wave of peasants from Latin America, forced here, that Trump is attacking in other areas. Obama, Trump attacks it worse. Obama delivers. Come on now. He deported more than anybody, black and brown, right? So We need to make clear it's open for all. And the financing, we've got to be clear. I think it's not going to be just growth. We've got to say tax the rich. We've got to be able to take that money back that's been redistributed over the last, from the zygote of the 60s, a little bit later to today, right? Huge, massive. We've got to tax the wealth and income. I know ideologically this is tough, but we've got to put it on the table. Homeowner, middle class people, working class people, your biggest form of wealth is your home. It's taxed. They tax it. Let's do that to the 1%, which is their stocks, bonds, and other real estate. We've got to tax that wealth and income, and we can't have, obviously, an empire, 800 military bases, $1 trillion. You can't do it. We're not going to lie. You got to speak the truth, right? It's going to have to take the dismantling of the war machine. So, but other than, for the basic line that Rustin is putting out about 1965 to really win the goals of the civil rights movement, which would have to bring in the broader working class, it needed a public works, and it's still true today. More true after the 40-year, 50-year war on the public sector that we face. Now, what I think is weakness, the problem was picture and with these smart people, right, that get together and outline this. No, I'm giving the outlines of what needs to be done, but we have to have a political strategy. We have to identify the political forces and strategy that can actually win this, or at least get this on the radar screen, okay? Now, Rustin argued that this could be won, we're talking about the mid-60s, by progressive forces taking over, quote, reorganizing the quote-unquote consensus party, the Democratic Party. And so what he meant was the civil rights activists, labor movement, labor officials, religious liberals and other liberals would kick out the Dixiecrats, the urban machines, and big business, to take it over, turn it into a people's party that could really win things like jobs for all, but especially jobs for all with public works. Now, looking back, we can look back 50 years, that party has been transformed, right? The Dixiecrats were kicked out. They went to the Republican Party, right? David Vitter. I guess Mary Langer said they were neighbors over in Broadmoor. I guess they fled to Metairie, a breeding ground for that new Republican Party. Neoliberalism, the dismantling of public service, it's kind of killed the urban machines. They don't have, even, Obama's man in Chicago, he doesn't have the same goodies to give out. And a whole layer of Black, Latino, women, Asian, gay, and other categories have been brought into the party. Members, officials at different, like Donna Brazile, much big official with Kenner, pulled herself up, she ran Gore's campaign. They've been brought into the party, okay? But the big business probably have controlled it even more thoroughly than they did in 1965. And so what happened was that new layer of the civil rights movement were brought in, but they didn't transform the party to get public works. They were transformed to dismantle what public services that we did have. And we can see concrete examples here in New Orleans, right? Or in Atlanta, or in Washington, D.C., or in Detroit, where the Black, and I think it's in this book, the Blackness Leadership, that's what I took from the Black Agenda Report, they represented their interests. They did very well. We talk about racial disparities, but if you look within the Black community, to use lack of a better word, the inequalities are even greater. So they put through this policy, and they did pretty well, right? And we saw in New Orleans pre-Katrina and post-Katrina, they were down for this. And we've seen that nationally, not just jumping on the bad Black Democrats. Latino, was that dog Villalobos out in the former unionist, teacher unionist, viciously attacked. He wants to be the new Latino Obama. I don't think it's going to go very far. So how do we win it, right? How do we win jobs for all? One thing is, despite this going against the ideological ground, and it's a long-term protracted struggle, the first step is, and this is part of the battle for ideas, we've got to say what we want. We've got to fight for what we want. We've got to take. Rustin was right. I had problems with where he went later, cheering on the Vietnam War. He was smooching with gold in my ear and that kind of. No, he did go off. Partly because he got embedded with the Democrats and he was a good guy, but when you got caught up in that system, that's where you logically went. So we've got to say what we want. Right? We want jobs for all. Free public services for all, legalization for all. That's the world we want. We want to present an alternative, a coherent vision. Not the left's, I'm opposed to this, I'm opposed to that. Or at best, the workers' world, 50 laundry list. We want a coherent program, an alternative vision in a way to get there. And that kind of jobs for all, free public service kind of does that. Let me just sketch out a little bit of an organizing agenda to get there, to get it, beginning to put it on the agenda, right? And we can, the silver lining, we can kind of use Katrina. We know David Brooks and the pundits for the ruling class, they used it for zoning, but we can do it from our position, our positionality. To use the term postmodernist way. But what would we sketch out? We would call, and I'm working with the New Jersey Jobs for All movement, but we advocate calling a conference of fighters from different struggles, right? Housing, the environment, education, police brutality, anti-war, anti-privatization, immigrant rights, we can go on. And how, we come there not arguing about jobs for all, free public service for all, but we're in agreement with that. But we talk about how would housing activists fighting gentrification, how would jobs for all, free public services for all meet your needs, meet your program? Put a kind of program. The same thing with all those different trains, those different silos. And then we talk about what are some common actions that we can take together to get this on the agenda. I'll use one example. We can use many. But here locally, they've got to be locally, it's got to be a national movement, but we've got to have some locally rooted movements. Currently, we've all heard about the affordable housing crisis. Rents have skyrocketed. Renters at third pay over 50% of their income for rent, heavily burdened, one of the highest in the country. But this happens all over. It's going in that direction. So, and in the city, they have the scatter sites. They killed the big developments that concentrated poverty, but they still have pockets of scattered sites, which were built in the late 60s to deconcentrate. It was kind of a concession to that underclass ideology, but we still have it, we'll take them. And they're located in the gentrifying neighborhoods in particular, the Bywater and Uptown. Now we have one side, the reaction, Nazi, but a little bit of extreme, but Stacey had, that layer does not want them rebuilt at all. Sell them all, get them out of here. They don't keep them up. The government just doesn't know how to do these things. Landrieu is the progressive position where he wants to do a mixed income. There are only a tiny number of apartments, but we're going to do a mixed income and give 4 or 5 apartments. Our position should be, right, this is our defense term. We want them all reopened. All this public housing, right? This is important to get some traction, but we also link it up to our broader demand of jobs for all, free public services, and that links in the immigrant rights movement, right? They've really been an ugly feature of post-Katrina New Orleans, playing off immigrants super exploited, brought in, black workers locked out, right? And really going. Now, how do we overcome that? Do you have the People's Institute come and do an undoing racism session and understand each other's position? We see the common class position that they face, and we fight for common demands. And so we say, yeah, immigrants should be open for that. We're not going to fight over a few apartments. We're going to be fighting for a massive jobs for all, housing for all. And we need those two groups united if we're going to have the power to win. Elections, yeah, I mean, I agree with Adolph, there's some problems, but I think we could begin to, not run one party, but we agree. What do we agree on? This is a platform that can kind of unite a variety of movements. We could run candidates around those demands. It might be Greens, it might be some other parties, but that would be one terrain, not the only terrain. The main thing is to get this on the agenda in some and some traction. Now, what are the obstacles? What are the obstacles? And I just we just draw up these ideas and it looks good and we put these manifestos out. I know there's a huge ideological mountain that we would have to climb, to scale, to really begin to make advances on this movement, right? But ideology is not simply ideas, it's practices, right? And we see this ideology played out. There's a left version of neoliberalism, right? We've got, in the Occupy movement, I was involved with a group that was fighting for jobs for all, and we were attacked by the neo-anarchist, the great David Graeber, let's throw around me. But his idea was, forget the state. The state is bad. Let's just build our alternative little world in Zuccotti Square. And we had a version of that here in New Orleans, like around Common Ground. A lot of the solidarity folks, the ones that didn't get caught up with Habitat for Humanity, real bad, but those were kind of consciously leftists. They gravitated toward Common Ground, which was not, they opened a clinic. They didn't defend Charity Hospital. They were going to open up a free school, not say public school, although they did get MLK, I'll give them that. Public housing, their big initiative was to buy a development on the West Bank, not down with the Jasper C3 and other groups defending reopening state public housing. They said it was a failure. And so that ideology is practiced, right? It's played out with a number of those groups. We would have to confront them. That's what's good about mounting the struggle. You put them on the spotlight. Where are you? The whole NGO foundation complex. They're tied to single issues. Some of them will do some good issues. They fund a lot of these progressive groups. If you read Jordan Flaherty's stuff, he kind of is the chronicler of the NGO movement. He'll look at some of the good things, but they are very hostile to building a broad movement, right? They'll stay on that narrow, they're going to be hostile. They're not going to join a class-wide movement, joining for jobs for all. And then we have the AFF, the unions. I agree with Adolph. They have to be a fighting force if we're going to win this. Much of the leadership, including where I'm a member of the AFT in New York, they have kind of administered the austerity, right? Accept what's realistic, right? Where we're well positioned in the public sector to raise these kind of demands. We are workers for the public sector, but we provide services for the broader working class. I advocate in my union, we put on the bargaining table free education, which existed at CUNY for 100 and so years until the mid-70s, the attack on neoliberalism. Even the unions, Trump is turning to the foundations, right? They're not talking. They've even made some efforts toward that. So those are some of the obstacles to really getting traction on this, building this. But I think that is not inconsistent, Adolph may respond, I don't think it's inconsistent with the idea that we are in this protracted struggle, but the first step is to put this on the agenda. As for Bernie Sanders, he's saying some of these things, free education for all, I like that. He's also talking about public works. If you read on his platform, it talks about with young people and adults, 14 million jobs. One of the problems is it's still, from how I understood it, read it, I might be corrected, it's kind of continuing the contracting out, which allows profits to go to these corporations, the contractors, and especially bad for black workers who, although in the public sector, black workers, that's one of the gains of the civil rights movement, cracking it open. We see in construction, for a variety of reasons, especially like contracting, they don't do very well. They're kind of isolated out. That's why a direct government would be better. And there's really no financing, and we need to talk about the military. But it's still, there are some good things. But Sanders himself, it was a very interesting, I'm going to end right here. It was a very interesting speech he gave recently, where he said, if I am elected, I will not be able to put through my program. The billionaire class, millionaire, will veto it, right? Because if he wins, he has the government. That's not the state. The whole state apparatus is controlled in a million different ways by the ruling class, by the billionaires. They control the means of production, the means of communication, right? But he did say the only way he could win it, or partially win it, whoever gets in there, if he presses concessions on the order, is if we have a movement. My amendment to that, and I agree in the main, is that that movement has to be independent of the Democrats. As we saw with the Civil Rights Movement, it confirmed the argument that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. We contest Bayard's thesis, right? And so as long as they know we're under the train of the Democrats, they don't have fear. The ruling class has no fear of the left at this point. If they see a movement developing, independently growing, bringing in larger layers of the working class, then they begin at least to cough up concessions in the short term. As we see here in New Orleans, they are emboldened. They are drunken with their triumph. Thank you. From the beginning. So I'm going to end there. And again, there is efforts to build that conference. We'd like to talk about that. But that's what this conference is about, not to have some academics or old-time frontliners. Mike is both PhD in political science, but his real education has been 30 years in class struggle. But let's open it up to questions now.
I love the Jobs for All movement, and I think that's great, but I don't think it would play out the same way this time as it did, during the public works administration, that sort of thing. And one of the things I'm worried about is how extremely hyper-hierarchical things have become. And, so, who's going to be the bosses in this Jobs for All movement? That concerns me because there's too many crazies out there, both on the left and the right, and I don't trust the left to be able to do it any better than the right has,
I'm afraid this really isn't a question, but it's a comment. Who's going to do the Jobs for All? Reservations about who's going to be the boss. I think as a part of the way forward, we need to be looking at the history, the 250-year history of the cooperative movement, where you had working people pooling their resources to meet their own needs that capitalists were not. In the end, they ended up not only owning their own storefronts, they owned, and this is in England, they owned furniture factories, they owned the steamship line bringing food from Australia and North America, they owned furniture factories, clothing factories, textile mills, farms, food processing facilities, and all of this by working people pooling their own resources and producing for their own need and not for profit. And this is something that, and all of this was from or through strictly democratically managed institutions. And this history, I stumbled on it, it's truly remarkable, and yet very few people know about this in this country. It's more well known over in Europe. But this was an international, global economic system run democratically, owned by working people, and I find that truly inspiring, and this needs to be part of the conversation about how we move forward. Thank you.
Yeah!
Hi, couple comments, and then you can respond if you'd like. The volunteer issue, homeowners turned to volunteers here because the road home completely failed them, and they were desperate. So that desperation drove them to seek out volunteers. But at the same time, it was very hard, and this touches on what Adolph said about getting any support from homeowners to reopen public housing. Yet some of these homeowners at least came from public housing. So it was a dilemma, and we didn't solve that. You're right, we didn't solve that. The other thing I'd like to point out is the let's see. The whole dispersion of poverty issue regarding public housing communities, and they were communities, they were real communities. Because Sharon, I talked to Kwana about what it was like to live in St. Bernard housing development, and they used to take on politics in the development. They took on police brutality in the development. So if you disperse these communities, then they can no longer work together on these issues. And that's been very critical to losing a strong working class force in the city, because they are dispersed all over the place now. And getting in touch with these folks, you know, they're in Houston, they're still everywhere, and also they're spread out all over the neighborhoods now. So that was a big accomplishment of the ruling class, and I think that's what was behind, really, the whole dispersal of poverty, was to disperse their political effectivity. The other thing is that the crisis of the planet, you know, and I think Jill Stein addresses this in her candidacy. She calls it a state of emergency. And I know that we need to build a campaign, and campaigns can be slow to build, but we also have a state of emergency going on where we really don't know how much longer we have to save the planet. You know, I'm just being blunt. You know, when we look at the conditions of the planet and what's going on now between Fukushima, dumping radiated water into the Pacific, and dead animals turning up on the West Coast now, and the effect of pesticides, GMOs, and so on. We really don't know how long we have. So we've got to, yes, build a campaign, but we've got to hurry it along somehow. And I think, you know, Jill Stein, she's running for president. I think her platform introduces some really cool concepts, as does Sanders, with which to take. It's more important for me to organize around the issues that the candidates are offering, and to use this as a basis for discussion and organizing.
Good evening. As being a community activist, more of a survey of the community and the issues from the place that every school now has been chartered. We took out school, and we didn't give elementary school to babies. So now we have babies being displaced because somebody got free and moved on to school that was already intact and was functioning properly. I have a problem with that. I have many problems because, like I said, in the community activist where I live, we don't get the president to visit us. You know, we don't get the mayor to visit us. So the problem that we have is never, unless I come to a forum like this, we don't get this in my community, if y'all understand what I'm saying. We totally, right now we're looking at annihilating of our babies. When our babies has to go to the other side of town, to the other side of town. I got 2 grandkids. Every morning they walk out the door. My heart is in my stomach till they get back home. 6 o'clock in the morning for a baby to be at the bus stop. We can't get anybody to really address these problems. This is our major problem. Our babies is our problem, and if we don't get this settled, and we don't get elementary school in the community, we just let people come in the community and take their own school. And they say we get a charter school for private entity. It's not for the public. You can't say you're going to go there because they pick and choose who you want there in this school. But these are our schools. And that's not the only point. The redeveloping now, since Katrina, Lane Grant, it's a big thing now. We can't get nobody to talk about Lane Grant, you know. And I have to look at all of these issues. So when I come to you, don't get mad at me, because I got so much to say. But I know I want to have it in good time. And this is another thing I want to ask. We're talking about the political. We're registered voters, but we can't get the message of any of this inner office people to come into this area of the city. We are in the city. We just in LJ's. And the locals of Valdez call it the cutoff. Really, we cut off from everything. So when I get to him and the mayor, he said, how they say that? I am like a troublemaker. But I'm gonna bring it to you like it is. You neglected me, I need to know why the hell you do this to me. This community needs to be developed. Katrina heard it too. No, we didn't flood, but we had all the debris from Katrina. We had the busted water line from Katrina. We still going through it. I'm homeless now because my house is full of black mold from the busted pipe line. Nobody look at that. So yes, when I come to this meeting, I don't need to be a nuisance to young people. But I'm just trying to get some stuff together. Somebody to look at Lower Algiers. When you go across the GNO Bridge, don't just stop at Algiers. That's another place down the highway we call Lower Algiers Cutoff. Come across that bridge sometime and look at these things. And how are we going to get anything any better from our political officials when all of them with the Ku Klux Klan and the Mafia? The black Ku Klux Klan sat on the council board. The black Ku Klux Klan sat there in the mayor's office and dictated to us. You know, so I identify you, man, that I don't know what to think about them. I think they all are Ku Klux Klan. Where you shoot.
Good evening. This is about block growth. It is your choice. Govern yourself or others will. This is your choice. Govern yourself or others will. Currently, you have no choice but to vote for the candidate candidates that have been chosen by the 1%. Currently, you have no choice but to vote for the candidates that have been chosen by the 1%. Think out of the box. The true democratic way is when the residents select the candidates. Think out of the box. The true democratic way is when the residents select the candidates. Cost, close to $0. Cost, close to $0. Votes determine winners, not the most money spent. Votes determine winners, not the most money spent. This is of the people, for the people, by the people.